We live in an age that has confused pleasure with beauty, sensation with meaning, and entertainment with genuine aesthetic experience. Walk through any modern city, browse any contemporary art gallery, or turn on popular television, and you will witness the systematic replacement of beauty with what merely stimulates, amuses, or gratifies. This confusion is not merely aesthetic, it is moral and spiritual. For when we mistake pleasure for beauty, we lose our capacity for that transformative encounter with the sublime that elevates the soul and connects us to something greater than ourselves. In my years of philosophical reflection, from the ancient corridors of Cambridge to the quiet contemplation of countryside walks, I have witnessed this degradation accelerate. The distinction between what truly moves the soul and what merely titillates the senses has become increasingly blurred, leaving us impoverished in ways we scarcely recognize. Beauty calls us beyond ourselves, demanding nothing less than our surrender to truth. Pleasure, by contrast, serves the self, offering immediate gratification without the discipline of genuine aesthetic judgment. The difference between these two experiences, one transcendent, the other merely personal, holds the key to understanding why our culture has lost its way and how we might recover our aesthetic bearings. In exploring this distinction, we discover not only the nature of beauty itself, but the path back to a life lived in harmony with the beautiful, the true, and the good. This is not merely an academic exercise but a spiritual necessity for anyone who refuses to accept the diminishment of human possibility that characterizes our age. Chapter 1: The Nature of Aesthetic Experience. True aesthetic experience differs fundamentally from mere sensory pleasure in its structure, purpose, and ultimate effect upon the soul. When I encounter genuine beauty, whether in Bach's Mass in B minor, the rose window of Chartres Cathedral, or the gentle contours of the English countryside, something remarkable occurs that transcends the boundaries of individual psychology and enters the realm of universal human experience. This transcendence is not mystical nonsense but a precise philosophical phenomenon that can be analyzed and understood. The first characteristic of aesthetic experience is what I call disinterested attention. Unlike pleasure, which focuses on what an object might do for us, aesthetic contemplation involves a particular kind of awareness that brackets personal desire and utility. When we stand before a beautiful landscape, we are not calculating its economic value or considering how it might serve our purposes. We are absorbed in pure contemplation, allowing the object to reveal itself on its own terms. This disinterested stance paradoxically creates the conditions for the most profound kind of personal engagement, one that transforms rather than merely satisfies. Second, aesthetic experience possesses what Kant correctly identified as universality without concept. Though beauty cannot be reduced to rules or formulas, our aesthetic judgments carry an implicit claim to universal validity. When I declare a sunset beautiful, I am not merely expressing personal preference but making a claim about the object itself, a claim I expect others to recognize and share. This universality distinguishes aesthetic judgment from mere taste or preference, which make no such claims upon others. Third, aesthetic experience involves what I term imaginative involvement. Beauty engages our imagination in ways that mere sensation cannot. A beautiful piece of music does not simply produce pleasant sounds in sequence, it creates an imaginative space where meaning unfolds through time, where tensions resolve, and where the soul finds both rest and awakening. The imagination, in aesthetic experience, becomes active rather than passive, creative rather than merely receptive. This imaginative dimension explains why beauty educates while pleasure merely satisfies. In genuine aesthetic experience, we learn to see, to hear, to feel with greater refinement and depth. We develop what the philosophical tradition calls taste, not arbitrary preference, but educated judgment trained through encounter with genuine excellence. The person who has learned to distinguish between authentic and counterfeit beauty possesses a kind of wisdom that extends far beyond the aesthetic realm into the very heart of human judgment and discrimination. Chapter 2: The Corruption of Aesthetic Judgment. Modern culture has systematically corrupted our capacity for aesthetic judgment by reducing all aesthetic experience to personal preference and subjective response. The relativist mantras of our time, "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder," "There's no accounting for taste," "Art is whatever the artist says it is," represent more than innocent broad-mindedness. They constitute a philosophical assault on the very possibility of aesthetic truth, and their consequences extend far beyond the art world into the foundations of civilized life itself. This corruption manifests most clearly in our educational institutions, where students are taught to analyze art sociologically, politically, or psychologically, in every way except aesthetically. They learn to decode symbols, unmask power structures, and identify cultural biases, but they are never taught to recognize beauty itself or to develop the patient attention that aesthetic appreciation requires. The result is a generation that can tell you about the economic conditions that produced a Renaissance painting but cannot explain why it moves the soul, that can analyze the gender dynamics in a piece of literature but cannot appreciate its linguistic beauty. The entertainment industry has accelerated this corruption by flooding our culture with products designed to stimulate rather than elevate. Popular music increasingly relies on volume, repetition, and sexual suggestion rather than melody, harmony, or meaningful lyrical content. The 3-minute song structure, driven by commercial radio requirements, has atrophied our capacity for sustained musical attention. Cinema substitutes spectacle for storytelling, sensation for character development, and shock for genuine emotion. These forms of entertainment succeed by appealing to our lowest impulses rather than cultivating our highest capacities. Perhaps most tragically, this corruption has invaded the traditional bastions of high culture. Contemporary art galleries showcase installations that deliberately assault rather than elevate the viewer. I have witnessed exhibitions that seem designed to test the limits of human tolerance for ugliness, noise, and meaninglessness. Museums present exhibitions that prioritize political messaging over aesthetic excellence, turning spaces once devoted to beauty into platforms for ideological manipulation. Concert halls program works that abandon melody, harmony, and rhythm, the very elements that make music beautiful, in favor of abstract concepts and intellectual games. The result is a kind of aesthetic numbness, a loss of the capacity to distinguish between the beautiful and the merely novel, the sublime and the sensational. We have become aesthetically illiterate, unable to recognize excellence when we encounter it, and increasingly satisfied with the crude stimulations that mass culture provides. This illiteracy represents not merely a cultural loss but a spiritual impoverishment that affects every aspect of human existence. Chapter 3: The Moral Dimension of Beauty. Beauty and morality are not merely connected, they are intimately intertwined at the deepest level of human experience. This connection, recognized by philosophers from Plato to Aquinas, from Kant to Schiller, reveals itself in the way that encounters with genuine beauty purify and elevate the soul, while immersion in ugliness degrades and corrupts it. To understand this connection is to grasp one of the most profound truths about human nature and the conditions necessary for flourishing life. Consider how beauty shapes character from the earliest stages of development. The child who grows up surrounded by beautiful objects, well-crafted furniture, thoughtfully designed spaces, carefully chosen artwork, develops an unconscious sense of order, proportion, and excellence that influences every aspect of life. The eye trained on beautiful forms learns to recognize harmony and proportion. The ear accustomed to beautiful music develops sensitivity to rhythm and melody. The imagination fed on beautiful stories learns to appreciate narrative structure and meaningful resolution. Conversely, constant exposure to ugliness, whether in the form of brutalist architecture, degraded popular music, or deliberately shocking art, damages the soul in ways that are difficult to repair. The aesthetic environment shapes our inner landscape, and those who surround themselves with the ugly, the crude, or the deliberately offensive find their capacity for moral discrimination gradually eroded. The person who learns to appreciate ugliness as art, noise as music, or meaninglessness as profound statement has already begun the process of moral corruption. This moral dimension of beauty explains why totalitarian regimes invariably attack aesthetic tradition. The Nazis burned books and destroyed, degenerate, art not from simple philistinism, but from recognition that beauty preserves and transmits values that threaten tyrannical control. Beautiful objects carry within themselves the memory of civilized life, of human dignity, of the possibility of transcendence, all of which pose implicit challenges to systems based on power and manipulation. During my experiences in communist Eastern Europe, I witnessed firsthand how the suppression of beauty served political control. The replacement of church architecture with concrete blocks, the promotion of crude socialist realism over genuine art, the systematic destruction of traditional crafts and cultural practices, all these serve to sever the connection between present and past, between individual and transcendent value, between personal experience and universal truth. The cultivation of aesthetic sensitivity thus becomes a form of moral education. Learning to distinguish between the beautiful and the merely fashionable, between the sublime and the sensational, between authentic art and clever pastiche, develops habits of discrimination that extend far beyond the aesthetic realm. The person who has learned to love beauty becomes, almost inevitably, a person who loves truth and goodness as well. Chapter 4: The Economics of Pleasure versus Beauty. The market economy, despite its many virtues, tends to favor pleasure over beauty because pleasure is easier to manufacture, market, and consume. Pleasure provides immediate satisfaction and requires no education or development of taste. Beauty, by contrast, demands time, attention, and often considerable preparation before it yields its rewards. This economic bias toward pleasure has profound consequences for our culture, creating a systematic preference for the immediate over the enduring, the sensational over the sublime. This bias manifests in every aspect of cultural production. The music industry promotes songs that grab attention in the first few seconds rather than compositions that unfold their beauty over time. The structure of commercial radio, with its emphasis on immediate hooks and frequent interruptions, has fundamentally altered the way music is composed and consumed. The result is a culture of 3-minute attention spans, where anything that requires sustained listening is automatically disadvantaged. Similarly, the film industry increasingly favors spectacle over storytelling, sensation over character development, and shock over genuine emotion. The economics of opening weekend box office returns create pressure for immediate impact rather than lasting value. Films that might reveal their beauty through multiple viewings, that reward contemplation and reflection, struggle to compete with those designed for immediate consumption and rapid forgetting. The publishing industry faces similar pressures. Books that promise instant gratification, whether through sensational subject matter, simplified language, or immediate emotional payoff, receive marketing support and prominent placement. Works that require patience, reflection, and perhaps some education to appreciate fully are increasingly marginalized. The result is a publishing landscape that systematically favors the temporary over the eternal, the accessible over the excellent. This economic bias creates what I call aesthetic inflation, where each new product must be more stimulating, more shocking, more immediately satisfying than the last. We see this most clearly in popular music, where volume increases, tempos accelerate, and lyrics become more explicitly sexual or violent in order to maintain audience attention. The same pattern appears in visual arts, where artists compete to create the most outrageous installations, the most shocking performances, the most deliberately offensive displays. Meanwhile, The institutions that preserve and transmit beauty, symphony orchestras, art museums, classical radio stations, serious publishers, struggle for survival in an environment that increasingly values only what can be immediately consumed and quickly forgotten. These institutions require long-term investment, patient cultivation of audience, and commitment to standards that may not yield immediate returns. In a culture dominated by quarterly profit reports and instant metrics, such institutions appear increasingly anachronistic. Yet this economic bias need not be permanent. Consumer preferences can be educated, and markets can be created for genuine excellence. The success of certain classical music recordings, the popularity of well-designed products, the enduring appeal of beautiful architecture all demonstrate that beauty retains its power to attract and satisfy, even in a culture dominated by the pursuit of pleasure. The challenge is creating economic conditions that support rather than undermine the cultivation of aesthetic sensitivity. Chapter 5: The Physiology of Beauty versus Pleasure. The difference between beauty and pleasure manifests even at the physiological level, in the distinct ways our bodies and brains respond to aesthetic experience versus mere sensory stimulation. Modern neuroscience, despite its limitations and reductionist tendencies, has begun to illuminate these differences in ways that confirm what philosophers have long observed about the fundamental distinction between these two modes of experience. Pleasure activates the brain's reward systems, the same pathways involved in addiction, consumption, and immediate gratification. When we eat something delicious, hear a catchy tune, or see something sexually attractive, specific neurotransmitters flood our system, creating a sense of satisfaction that is typically brief and requires increasing stimulation to maintain. This neurochemical response explains why popular entertainment must constantly escalate: louder music, more explicit imagery, greater sensory bombardment, to achieve the same effect. The pleasure response follows the classic pattern of tolerance and habituation. What initially provides satisfaction gradually requires more intense stimulation to achieve the same result. This is why drug addicts require ever-increasing doses, why pornography becomes progressively more extreme, why popular music grows ever louder and more aggressive. The pleasure centers of the brain, designed for occasional rewards, become overstimulated and demand constant feeding. Beauty, by contrast, appears to activate different neural networks entirely. Studies of people contemplating beautiful artworks, natural landscapes, or mathematical proofs show activation in areas associated with meaning-making, pattern recognition, and what neuroscientists call default mode network activity, the brain state during quiet contemplation and reflection. These responses tend to be more sustained, more deeply satisfying, and more conducive to overall well-being. The physiological effects of beauty extend beyond the brain to the entire body. Encounters with beauty tend to slow the heart rate, deepen breathing, and create a sense of calm alertness that can persist for hours or even days. The Japanese practice of forest bathing, simply spending time in natural beauty, demonstrates how immersion in beautiful environments produces measurable improvements in immune function, stress hormone levels, and overall health. Similarly, patients in hospitals recover more quickly when their rooms overlook gardens or contain beautiful artwork. The presence of beauty appears to activate healing mechanisms that go far beyond psychological comfort. Music therapy, when it employs genuinely beautiful music rather than mere entertainment, can produce remarkable improvements in conditions ranging from depression to chronic pain. This physiological dimension explains why beauty, unlike pleasure, never loses its power to satisfy. We can become jaded by repeated exposure to the same pleasurable stimuli, but we can return again and again to the same beautiful object, a favorite piece of music, a beloved landscape, a treasured painting, and find it as moving as ever. Beauty refreshes rather than depletes, elevates rather than merely stimulates. The implications of these physiological differences extend beyond individual experience to cultural health. A society that prioritizes pleasure over beauty is literally creating conditions for widespread addiction, dissatisfaction, and spiritual emptiness. The epidemic of depression, anxiety, and meaninglessness that characterizes modern life may be directly related to our aesthetic impoverishment, to our systematic replacement of beauty with mere stimulation. Chapter 6: The Cultural Consequences of Confusion. When a culture systematically confuses beauty with pleasure, the consequences extend far beyond the aesthetic realm into the heart of civilization itself. We witness this confusion in the degradation of our public spaces, the vulgarization of our entertainments, and the loss of those shared aesthetic standards that once united communities around common ideals of excellence. This cultural transformation represents not merely a change in taste but a fundamental alteration in the conditions of human flourishing. Consider the transformation of our urban environments over the past century. Cities that once aspired to beauty, with grand boulevards, noble public buildings, and carefully planned parks, now prioritize efficiency, economy, and novelty over aesthetic consideration. The result is an environment that may function adequately but fails to inspire or elevate those who inhabit it. Brutalist architecture, with its deliberate rejection of human scale and proportion, creates spaces that may shelter the body but starve the soul. The replacement of traditional urban planning with modernist principles has created cities that serve economic functions but fail to create the conditions for genuine community life. Strip malls, parking lots, and generic corporate buildings dominate landscapes that once featured architectural diversity, human-scaled neighborhoods, and public spaces designed for contemplation and social interaction. The result is an environment that encourages isolation, consumption, and spiritual emptiness. This aesthetic impoverishment has profound psychological consequences. People who live in beautiful environments report higher levels of life satisfaction, stronger community bonds, and greater sense of meaning and purpose. Those condemned to live in ugly surroundings experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, and social dysfunction. The built environment literally shapes consciousness. And when we create ugly spaces, we create conditions for ugly lives. The corruption of aesthetic judgment also undermines cultural transmission, the process by which civilizations pass on their accumulated wisdom to future generations. When parents, teachers, and cultural institutions can no longer distinguish between the beautiful and the merely fashionable, they lose the ability to transmit the great works of art, literature, and music that have sustained human culture across centuries. Children grow up without exposure to the masterpieces that once formed the common cultural inheritance of educated people. This cultural amnesia manifests in the increasing difficulty that young people have in appreciating any art that requires patience, attention, or developed taste. Symphony concerts struggle to attract audiences under 40, serious literature finds fewer readers each year, traditional crafts and skills disappear as they are replaced by mass-produced alternatives. The very concept of high culture becomes suspect, dismissed as elitist or exclusionary rather than recognized as humanity's finest achievements. The confusion of beauty with pleasure also contributes to the widespread loss of shared cultural standards. When aesthetic judgment becomes merely a matter of personal preference, communities lose the common ground necessary for cultural cohesion. Without shared appreciation for excellence, societies fragment into isolated subcultures, each with its own aesthetic standards and values. The result is cultural balkanization, where common conversation becomes impossible and social bonds weaken. Perhaps most tragically, this confusion contributes to the profound sense of meaninglessness that characterizes modern life. When aesthetic experience becomes merely another form of consumption, we lose one of humanity's primary sources of transcendence and meaning. Beauty, properly understood, connects us to something greater than ourselves, to truth, to goodness, to the divine. Pleasure, no matter how intense, leaves us ultimately isolated in our subjectivity, craving ever more stimulation to fill the emptiness that beauty alone can satisfy. Chapter 7: Recovering the Sense of Beauty. The recovery of genuine aesthetic experience requires both individual effort and cultural transformation. It demands nothing less than a fundamental reorientation of our relationship to the world of objects, experiences, and values. This is not merely a matter of changing our entertainment preferences or decorating our homes differently, but of recovering a capacity for transcendence that modern life systematically undermines. For the individual, recovery begins with the cultivation of what I call aesthetic discipline, the willingness to engage with beautiful objects on their own terms rather than demanding immediate satisfaction or entertainment. This discipline involves several interconnected practices, each requiring patience, commitment, and gradual development over time. First, we must learn to slow down and pay attention. In our age of constant stimulation and perpetual distraction, the capacity for sustained contemplation has atrophied. We must deliberately create spaces of quiet where beauty can unfold its meaning without competition from the noise of contemporary life. This might mean listening to a complete symphony without interruption, spending an afternoon in a museum without rushing from painting to painting, or simply sitting quietly in a beautiful natural setting without the urge to photograph or document the experience. Second, we must educate our taste through systematic encounter with excellence. This means seeking out the great works of art, literature, and music that have sustained human culture across centuries. It means reading poetry aloud to appreciate its sound as well as its meaning, attending live performances rather than relying on recorded music, visiting architectural masterpieces to experience their spatial qualities, and surrounding ourselves with objects of genuine beauty rather than mere decoration or fashion. Third, we must learn to distinguish between the authentic and the counterfeit. This requires developing critical faculties that can recognize the difference between works that genuinely embody beauty and those that merely simulate its effects. Such discrimination comes only through experience and education, through comparing the genuine article with its imitations until the differences become as clear as the difference between fresh air and pollution. Fourth, we must cultivate what I call aesthetic memory, the ability to carry beautiful experiences within us and draw upon them for sustenance and guidance. This involves not merely remembering beautiful objects but allowing them to become part of our inner landscape, shaping our imagination and providing standards for judgment. The person who has internalized authentic beauty carries with them a kind of spiritual wealth that no external circumstances can destroy. At the cultural level, recovery requires the restoration of aesthetic education in schools, the support of institutions that preserve and transmit beauty, and the creation of environments that encourage contemplation rather than mere consumption. This means defending classical music education against those who would replace it with popular entertainment, supporting serious art museums against pressures for crowd-pleasing exhibitions, preserving architectural heritage against the demands of commercial development. We must also work to create new institutions that can serve beauty in our contemporary context. This might mean establishing schools that prioritize aesthetic education, creating spaces for contemplation and reflection in our cities, supporting artists and craftspeople who maintain traditional skills and standards, and developing new forms of patronage that can sustain excellence rather than merely popularity. Most importantly, we must reclaim the language of beauty itself, insisting that aesthetic judgments are not merely matters of personal preference but claims about reality that can be justified, argued, and shared. Only by recovering confidence in the objectivity of beauty can we hope to distinguish it from the mere pleasure that so often masquerades as aesthetic experience. This recovery will not be easy. It requires swimming against the current of contemporary culture, resisting the pressures of commercial entertainment, and accepting that genuine beauty makes demands upon us that pleasure never does. But the rewards are correspondingly great. a life enriched by encounter with transcendent value, a culture capable of inspiring rather than merely amusing, and a legacy worthy of transmission to future generations. Conclusion. The distinction between beauty and pleasure is not merely academic but vital to the health of our souls and the future of our civilization. Beauty calls us beyond ourselves, connecting us to truth and goodness in ways that transform consciousness and elevate character. Pleasure, while not inherently wrong, serves the self and offers only temporary satisfaction without the deeper fulfillment that comes from genuine aesthetic experience. Throughout my years of philosophical reflection, I have witnessed the gradual triumph of pleasure over beauty in nearly every sphere of human activity. This triumph represents not progress but regression, a return to a more primitive state of consciousness where immediate gratification takes precedence over lasting value, where sensation matters more than meaning, where the self becomes the measure of all things. Yet this triumph is not inevitable. Beauty retains its power to move the human heart, to inspire the imagination, and to connect us with transcendent value. In quiet moments, when we escape the noise of contemporary culture, we can still experience that sense of wonder and reverence that genuine beauty evokes. These moments remind us of what we have lost and point the way toward what we might recover. The choice before us is clear. We can continue down the path of aesthetic degradation, accepting the reduction of human experience to mere pleasure and entertainment, or we can undertake the more difficult but infinitely more rewarding task of recovering our capacity for beauty. This choice will determine not only our personal capacity for meaning and transcendence but the kind of culture we leave to future generations. Will we bequeath a world that has forgotten the difference between the beautiful and the merely pleasant? Or will we preserve and transmit the wisdom that recognizes beauty as one of humanity's highest achievements and most reliable guides to truth? The answer lies in our willingness to slow down, pay attention, and allow beauty to work its transformative magic in our lives. For in the end, beauty is not simply something we observe but something that observes us, calling us to become worthy of the sublime vision it offers to those who have eyes to see.